so these are the paints we'll be using for this molten sword painting tutorial. Welcome over to my disgusting old wet palette. For the dark red in this lineup, I've used Burnt Red by Vallejo. It's kind of similar to Corn Red, but as you can see it's easy enough to mix your own just by adding a little black into Mephiston Red. Similarly for the off-white yellow, here I've used Ice Yellow by AK Interactive, but a mix of Flash Gitz Yellow and Pure White works just as well. So I was rooting through my pile of shame trying to find a suitable model for this tutorial, and I came across this Space Marine push fit fella. So I'm going to give it a try with this. Here the model's been primed black and then dry brushed with an off-white. Keeping the sword separate is definitely going to help with the painting, although I haven't quite decided what to do about that power supply running down the blade. I think I'll have to worry about that when I get to it. Now our general approach is going to be starting with the darkest colour and working up to the lightest. So first paint going on, and this is going to be the Vallejo Dark Red, which is going over the whole blade. I really don't care about the accuracy. All I want to do is get a really nice solid base coat down. Almost all of this colour is going to be obscured as we go along. And this is where the first bit of, I suppose, technique comes in. Starting from the mid-red, using Mephiston Red, I'm going to paint inside the dark red, covering the majority of the length of the blade, but I'm not going to go all the way down. Some tutorials I've seen tend to keep quite concentric, uniform shapes, just covering a smaller and smaller area each time. This can be really good for molten effects using glazes, but instead I want to create some texture and hopefully the impression of something actively burning. And I'm going to do that by making little scratches. These are going to be angled back towards the hilt of the sword, pulling the paint from the dark red area into where I've just painted the Mephiston Red, so the majority of the paint deposits at the end of that brush stroke. As you can see, I need to repeat this scratching effect using the same mid-red colour, adding a couple of layers of thinned down Mephiston Red like this, just to make sure it's a noticeable step brighter than the dark red. Otherwise that jump to the next colour is going to be too stark. I also layer up the colour around the base of the blade to increase the saturation. And if you make any mistakes like I did here, then just wick it away with your finger. Job done, no harm, no foul. After that mid-red, we move up to a lighter red. I've used Pro Acryl Orange here, but G-Dub's Wild Rider Red is pretty much identical. It's just a slightly different consistency. From this stage on, you're going to want to test the consistency of any paint before it goes anywhere near your model, as we're working on smaller and smaller areas. You want it thin enough so that it goes on nice and smoothly, but not so thin that it's just a puddle of coloured water getting pushed around. You'll see that I started my brush strokes from the tip of the blade this time, pulling them towards the hilt. Again, this is so that when I lift the bristles at the end of the brushstroke, we don't get a noticeable splodge of paint resting where the softer transitions should be. You also notice I spent a lot of time with my little finger resting on the cork. This is creating a really stable brace for me so that my hands aren't wobbling around in thin air. Once I've done a couple of passes of the blade with the light red inside that Mephiston, I then go back to those same scratches, making sure I keep the same angle as I used before, just starting them a little further away from the edge of the blade and pulling them into the center. And this is where we are at the moment. Not looking anything like Fiery Blade, but we've got some nice reds in there and starting to build up a little bit of that texture. Now we're going to take a next step up into a dark orange, where I'm using Troll Slayer orange here. I'm going to keep the paint nice and thin, braced my finger, and we're going to build up a really nice solid base layer of color around the center of the blade. Then following that, we're going to start stippling those scratches around the edges. And with the dark orange down, I think the sword's starting to look a little bit fiery. Time to go a little brighter again with Fire Dragon Bright. No surprises for guessing that we're going to repeat the previous step, just covering a smaller area with both the central build-up of block colour and those angled scratches. Right, with the reds and the oranges out of the way, now we're entering the yellow realm, kicking off with Uriel Yellow. As we're now limiting ourselves to covering really quite a small surface area, I'm becoming a bit more conscious of mistakes. So to be safe, I start tracing the lines I'm going to make without any paint on the brush, planning where I'm going to be making those first brush strokes along the center line of the blade. And so at this point, I'm starting the brushstroke approximately halfway along the blade. This is the point at which we start appreciating that less is more. Quick wash of the brush, rotate the model, check the consistency, and back we go to the scratches. At this stage, the scratches are essentially just stippling for that added bit of texture, but we don't want to encroach too much on the previous work we've done with those reds and those oranges. Once I've done a first pass of the scratches with the Uriel yellow, I go back to add another layer along the center line, adding an extra punch of color and heat. And I think that's starting to look pretty good. Okay, onwards and upwards to Flash Gets Yellow. Again, a quick trace of the first line before touching bristles to model, and we're really focusing on about a third of the blade length, if not less. We're still pulling those brush strokes towards us to protect the transitions, and then adding really quite small scratches and stipples, and then just identifying areas where we need a little bit of extra Flash Gets Yellow to push the strength of that colour a little bit more. You'll probably be delighted to know that we're now at the brightest step, which is that ice yellow from AK Interactive, or a blend of Flash Gets Yellow and white. I'm going to be limiting this colour to only the most raised parts of that power cord and the very core of the blade. Off camera, I'm going back to the palette and adjusting the amount of paint on the brush. I'm not 100% confident at this stage, so I make sure that my first contact point is somewhere which I know is going to be relatively safe. It's important to take your time at this stage. Coming to the end, the temptation's always there to rush, but that's where mistakes are made. Here I do make a bit of a splodge, so I quickly wipe away the excess paint with my finger. A quick check around the model, and where necessary I go back in, adding a little bit more ice yellow to the hottest points of the blade. So the great news is that is the red to white transition finished. Perhaps counterintuitively, we're now going to go to the darkest color, which is a matte black, and we're going to do some dry brushing. I've removed almost all of the excess paint, and I'm going to start just flicking the bristles of this banged up old brush against the edge of the blade, focusing on the coolest parts, creating a really nice ashy effect. So just take your time, work your way around the model, adding some nice light flicks. Now around here is where I should have stopped. Instead, as you'll see, I continued. I basically got carried away in wanting to push that effect, which, as you'll see, resulted in me adding way too much black to the mini. So here you can see how overdoing that dry brushing step has led to me obscuring areas that I wanted to be hot. Where we'd like to show off those earlier transitions, we now just have deposits of black paint in a way that makes no sense. To try and correct this, I return to touch up the areas with previous colors like the ice white. You'll see that I do lose some of the transitions that I created, but this is a bit of a salvage job at this stage. I even have a go at glazing the orange, but there's no way I'm going to get that to cover the black, so I'm going to have to use traditional layering. I spent a couple of minutes correcting the orange off camera, and it's looking okay. If I flip the sword over and show the other side, it probably looks a bit better. The effect is a little bit cleaner, and we've got both the transitions through the colors from the dark reds all the way through to that ice yellow. And the textures of the scratches add a real grittiness, creating that really nice burning effect. And here's the finished sword back on the model. This technique will work on other weapons as well, so flaming axes? Absolutely. Thanks for watching.